Your ticket says the train leaves at 3. The town clock says 2:52. The clock inside the station says 3 o'clock. Your pocket watch is still set to the city you left that morning, and the train is beginning to move. Before modern time zones, catching a train did not simply mean knowing the time. It meant knowing whose time the railroad trusted. For most of human history, that question barely mattered. A town could set noon when the sun reached its highest point in the local sky. A prominent church clock, courthouse clock, or jeweler's clock could keep the community close to that local time. Travel a little east or west, and noon arrived a little earlier or later. The difference between neighboring towns might be only a few minutes. When travel moved at the speed of a horse, those minutes were rarely worth reorganizing daily life around. Railroads changed the scale of the problem. A train could cross several local times before lunch. A schedule written for one town's clock could be wrong by the next stop, even when every clock was working perfectly. The clocks did not disagree because they were inaccurate. They disagreed because they were answering different suns. So the first answer was not a national time zone. It was railroad time. Beginning in the 1850s, railroads increasingly chose an operating time for their own lines or regions. A company might follow the time of its headquarters or another agreed standard. Its trains, timetables, and station operations then used that railroad time as they passed through towns whose local clocks could show something different. For a passenger, the practical rule was simple: do not assume your watch is the authority. Read the timetable, identify the railroad standard, and follow the station clock that governed the train. At a small station served by one line, that might be manageable. At a major junction, several railroads could bring several operating times into the same building. Travelers might encounter multiple clocks or timetables, each correct for a different company. The number, 3 o'clock, was not enough. It needed a hidden label, 3 o'clock according to which railroad. Passengers saw the confusing public side of the system. Train crews had to make it work safely. Before a run, conductors, engineers, firemen, and trainmen reported to a railroad office. There, the company maintained a standard clock. Crew members set their pocket watches against it so the people controlling the train began with the same time. That shared minute mattered because the conductor was the chief officer of the train. At departure and station stops, the engineer waited for the conductor's clearance. Timetables and operating rules assumed that both men were reading the same clock, even when they were miles apart later in the run. A timetable was not merely information for passengers. On many lines, it was part of the operating system that kept trains separated. But agreeing on one railroad time did not solve everything. The watch carrying that time also had to remain accurate. In August 1853, a fatal accident on the Providence and Worcester Railroad was blamed in part on an inaccurate conductor's watch. The collision did not create time zones, but it exposed a deeper weakness: a shared schedule was only as reliable as the timepieces used to follow it. Some New England railroads responded by tightening operating rules and buying better watches and clocks. Over time, railroads developed formal requirements for employee watches. Crew members had to submit them to designated watch inspectors, often independent jewelers working under contract. An inspection record showed whether the watch met the company's standard. The ritual was precise. Sign in. Compare your watch with the standard clock. Record or correct any difference. Carry that time through the run. Return the watch for inspection at required intervals. The railroad had turned time from a local observation into a regulated workplace tool. That made one company more dependable. It did not make the continent simple. By the early 1880s, North American railroads were operating under about 50 regional time standards. Behind those standards were hundreds of local times still used by towns and cities. The workaround had become another system to translate. A passenger changing lines might need to convert one railroad's time into another. A station agent might publish or interpret several standards. Connections became harder to coordinate as the network grew, and every new route created more places where two definitions of the same hour could meet. One object from the period captures the problem perfectly: a double-time pocket watch. It could display local time and railroad time at once. That was ingenious. It was also an admission that ordinary time had split in two. Railroad managers wanted a simpler network. In 1881, they commissioned William Frederick Allen, secretary of the General Time Convention and publisher of the Traveler's Official Railway Guide, to develop a practical plan. Allen did not invent the idea of standard time alone. Astronomers, scientists, educators, and railway planners had proposed related systems before him. His importance was organizational. He built a plan the railroads could actually agree to use. The plan divided North American railway operations into 5 broad zones: intercolonial, Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. The 4 main continental U.S. zones were based on central meridians 15 degrees of longitude apart. Because Earth turns 15 degrees in roughly 1 hour, neighboring zones differed by 1 hour instead of an unpredictable handful of minutes. In October 1883, railroad officials approved the system. Then they had to make thousands of clocks change together. Railroad representatives persuaded city governments and businesses to cooperate. Newspapers printed instructions and maps. The U.S. Naval Observatory and the Allegheny Observatory agreed to transmit telegraph signals that railroads could use to synchronize their clocks. On Sunday, November 18, 1883, standard railway time went into effect. At the appointed moment, station clocks were reset to the new zone time. Conductors adjusted their watches. New timetables replaced the old ones. A patchwork of railroad standards became a much smaller set of shared clocks. In several cities, noon arrived twice. New York's local noon occurred roughly 4 minutes before noon under the new Eastern Standard. A clock could strike 12 according to the sun, be adjusted, and then reach 12 again according to railroad time. That is why the change became known as the Day of Two Noons. The transition was remarkably smooth, but it was not universally loved. Some people saw standard time as an attack on local control or on time defined by nature. Communities near zone boundaries could find the new clock noticeably out of step with the sun. And the railroads had no federal law forcing the public to obey them. They did not need one at first. If a town wanted reliable train service, business connections, telegraph coordination, and published schedules, following railroad time was practical. City governments, stores, offices, and households gradually reset their clocks because the network had become more useful than local noon. For 35 years, the United States largely lived with a time system created and maintained by industry practice. Federal law formally recognized standard time in 1918. By then, the hidden rule was already established: a schedule cannot coordinate distant people unless they agree on the meaning of the clock. Time zones did not make every clock more accurate. A badly maintained watch could still lose minutes. And standard noon was often less faithful to the sun directly above one particular town. What time zones changed was agreement. They allowed a passenger, a station agent, a conductor, and an engineer, people separated by distance and working for a vast network, to treat 3 o'clock as the same operational instruction. That is why your departure time now looks so simple. A number on a ticket can tell you when to arrive only because cities, railroads, clocks, timetables, and millions of watches have already agreed which 3 o'clock it means.